Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 1.3 million times worldwide and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. Coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country.
In today's episode, episode 349, brought to you by Australian Hiker, we're going to talk about walking speed and hiking. We hope you enjoy. If you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the supporters page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. In 2018, I undertook my first really long hike, spending 35 days walking the 1,000-kilometre Bibbulmun Track in Western Australia. In preparation for this walk, I spent the 18 months prior setting myself a number of physical challenges to see what I was capable of. The aim of these challenges wasn't about breaking or setting records. It was about working out how much annual leave I needed to take from my job and, based on that, what I needed to achieve each day. In this podcast, we discuss why you should know your walking speeds and, in addition, look at the health implications. So what do we mean by walking speed? This might appear obvious, but in most cases, hikers will typically take walking speed to be the distance travelled while walking over a set period of time. And in fact, my Garmin GPS measures walking pace in this way. In walking out my working pace, I take the distance travelled over a set period, but I don't just include walking time, I also include breaks because I want to know how many kilometres I need to average each day, and that's regardless of lunch and morning tea and afternoon tea breaks. So in that instance, my walking pace is probably a bit less than it should be, or less than most people's are, only because I am including the breaks. When working out my walking speed for hiking, I don't do things by half. In that way, I have an obsessive personality. In 2016, when Jill and I walked the 232-kilometre Larapinta Trail, we were averaging 17 kilometres per minute, or roughly 3 kilometres per hour. Certainly not a record-breaking pace by any means. As I mentioned, over the next 18 months in the lead up to starting the Bibbulmun Track, I undertook a number of on-trail challenges in a variety of terrains to better refine the distance that I would expect to walk when I started the Bibbulmun Track. Now, these are excessive and obsessive, there's no doubt about that, but I wanted to see how far I could push myself and what I was actually capable of. So walking 145-kilometre Canberra Centenary walk in 3 days, walking the 112-kilometre distance from Kyandra to Canberra, which is the last section of the Australian Alps walking track, again in 3 days, walking the 53-kilometre distance there and back to Mount Bimbri in 1 day. And in addition, I did a number of walks where I was walking between 22 to 42 kilometres in a single day, and that included some walking events, just to see how I'd go through and deal back-to-back on some of these walks. Now, the end result of this extensive, and I do say perhaps excessive testing, was that I ended up with 2 hiking speeds with a fully loaded pack. I did allow some leeway on these speeds to provide a buffer in case of any unforeseen circumstances. So the first speed that I use is the average speed when I'm walking in the Australian Alps and also when I'm walking on the beach in walking on soft sand, and soft beach sand will really slow you down. And this was 2.75 kilometres per hour. The second was my average speed around a typical hike. And by typical, I mean a trail where you have good solid walking tread. And this includes a variety of flat and hilly conditions, but not steep mountains like you expect to get in the Alps. And in this case, I work on a speed of 3.75 kilometres per hour. So what this meant in the case of planning for the Bibbulmun Track, I decided to average 32 kilometres per day, as this is something I felt that I could do quite comfortably. And it's also a figure that's thrown about on US based long distance trail hiking, where that's given that as being a good figure to achieve on a regular basis. Now, one comment I would make here is on the Bibbulmun Track, I was paying close attention to what I was doing. And as I said, I do have a GPS that does measure average kilometres travelled per hour. And in one instance where I was doing some road walking on a detour because I couldn't get along a beach, I was averaging around about 5.75 kilometres per hour, which is pretty decent sort of speed. I wasn't maintaining that for the whole walk, but certainly I was getting there and pushing the speeds quite well. One comment I would make with average speeds as well, it depends to a great extent on the duration of the hike. I found with the Bibbulmun Track, by the time I reached the end of week 3, and this was a 5-week long walk, my fitness had really peaked. And while it was probably improving in the final 2 weeks, it was hardly noticeable. So I know at the end of 3rd week, coming into Collie, I was going up a fairly steep hill. And the only reason I was stopping at that stage was because I wanted to stop and take photos for no other reason. By checking out your own walking speed based on your actual hiking, this is going to give you the most accurate indication of what your walking speeds are. Speeds I've given you may suit some hikers, may not. They might be too slow for some, or they might be too fast for others. And certainly these days, I'm not travelling as fast as those speeds. Going through and using your own hikes and keeping records of start time and finish time and distance travelled and the terrain, that's certainly going to give you the most accurate sort of distances or speed for your own individual circumstances. Now, factors to consider when talking about hiking speed is to get the most accurate figure. Ideally, you do want to use your own research based around your own walking. So next time you go out for a walk, whether it's a 5, 10, 15, 20 kilometre walk or a multi-week walk, go through and do your start time, your finish time and your distance. And that way it'll give you a good basic figure to work with. And it might say that, okay, over a period of 1 day, you did that 20 kilometres in 5 hours, which means you're travelling at 4 kilometres an hour. Over a period of 2 or 3 weeks, you might find that you hiked for, say, 15 days or 18 days over that period, and you averaged X amount of kilometres on a daily basis. And sometimes the distance you travel might be based on where the shelters are or how easy you want to make it. But certainly if you're only doing small distances and you're doing them fast, that's going to give you a good indication of your hourly walking speed. So when considering your walking speed, the key factors you want to look at is log your start and finish time, look at the distance travelled, and identifying the main terrain. So is it flat ground? Is it hills? Is it mountain? Is it soft sand or hard sand? That can have a big impact. And if that's the case, break it down into each of those categories. So in my case, if I'm walking on soft sand, my walking speed I work on is 2.75 kilometres per hour. If I'm walking in the Australian Alps, that will often involve hill or mountain walks, and I will again work on 2.75 kilometres per hour. If I'm walking on relatively flat ground with good trail tread, I'll boost it up to 3.75 kilometres per hour. And even though I'll often be travelling faster than that, and on my recent walk on the Great Southwest Walk, I was having periods where I was travelling at around about 4.3 kilometres per hour. But I tend to bring that down a bit just to give me a bit of leeway, a bit of extra time if things do go wrong. Additional factors you can factor into this as well is the weight you carry on your back. If you're carrying a day pack that weighs 6 kilos as opposed to carrying a fully loaded pack with 10 days of food and 2 days of water, you could be carrying 20 kilos, you are going to be walking at a different pace. So knowing that, okay, this is what my average pack weight is, if I'm going to be carrying 3 or 4 kilos extra because of the hike dictates it, I'm definitely going to be walking slower than that. And this is where if you build that bit of extra leeway in there, you tend to be covered. Footwear used. Strangely enough, the fastest I have ever travelled while I've been hiking was with a pair of really heavy grade leather boots. Now, the reason for that was I was coming down a fairly steep slope that was really dusty, had a lot of small rocks that are almost like marbles, And I know when I'd come down there on a few days beforehand on my trail runners, I was having to take it very gently because I was ending up going skating on these very small rocks. Whereas the leather boots just seemed to bolt me to the ground. So just because you are wearing boots as opposed to trail runners, it's not necessarily going to be the difference you think it is. But having said that, using boots does require more energy, and it's going to sap your energy a bit more. So again, it's worthwhile if you're going to be using boots all the time or a mixture of boots and trail runners, go through and test that walk for each of those to see what the impact's going to be. And last but not least, temperature and humidity. I find that once the temperature gets over 25 degrees Celsius, it really saps the energy from me. And humidity is the same. I'm not a big fan of hiking in really humid conditions. I just don't enjoy it because it just saps the energy. And you'll find that my ideal temperatures sit between around about 12 to 18 degrees. And in the case of my upcoming Hyson Trail Track later this year, that's the sort of temperatures I'm going to be getting for most of my walk. I always find that it's easy to get warm, and if you find that when you start walking first thing in the morning, you may have your jacket on for first 10, 15, 20 minutes and then stop and take it off because you've warmed up and you're now too hot. So it's the sort of thing that, as I said, it's much easier to get warm when you hike, whereas if it's 25, 30 degrees, all you can do to get cool is to start earlier in the day, have a break during the middle of the day and have more breaks, and then hike into the evening when the sun's starting to drop below the sky and it's starting to cool down again. As I said, I spent 18 months doing that and doing an awful lot of hiking, covering some big distances to see exactly what I was capable of. If you don't want to go to that extent, there is a thing which I only discovered when I was doing this article and this podcast, and that's a thing called Naismith's Rule. Now, Naismith's Rule was developed in 1892 by a Scottish mountaineer, William Naismith, and is designed to help with planning a walking or a hiking trip, and it gives you a set of figures to work with to give you a good indication. Now, Naismith's Rule works on distance travelled and time travelled, and also looks at altitude gained as well. In the roughly 140 years since then, there's been a number of changes or adaptations made to this rule, and some of those include also the descent as well as the ascent, and they're getting them more and more accurate. If you go through the written version of this podcast in our advice section, you'll find that I've got a series of links that will help you out, including to some online calculators. In looking at Naismith's Rule, you do need to be happy with doing some basic maths. In adding the variations to it, you need to be much better at maths than I am. So the calculators make things much easier, and you still need to sort of work out how long it takes you to cover certain distances, but the calculators do make things so much easier. Now, the reason for knowing your hiking speed, as I mentioned, the key one was working out how many days I have to put in for my leave to take time off work. And you can't just sort of wing it then, you can't say, oh, look, I want 4 weeks off work and 6 weeks later you're still hiking and you're trying to get extra leave, or you're going to have to come back again. Having a good indication of your hiking speed will provide an indicative amount of time you require to do a particular walk, and will also let you know roughly how much time you can hike during a day and how many kilometres you can cover during a day. So in my case, as I said, 32 kilometres a day is what I averaged, but I had some days that I was doing, my biggest day on the Bibbulmun Track was 44 kilometres. I had a few days that were above 35 to 40 kilometres. I had some days that were less than that. But I did end up averaging for the entire trip that 32 kilometres per day. One thing I did do with the Bibbulmun Track is I actually planned on doing it in 36 days and managed to pick up an extra day because I was travelling faster than I had expected. The other thing that I picked up from this, doing the research for this podcast and article, was the health implications of walking speed. Now, this has got nothing to do with hiking. Hiking will keep you fit, you enjoy it, that's fine. The health implications of walking speed is aimed at what they class as geriatric health. And there was a white paper I came across which was called White Paper, Walking Speed, the Sixth Vital Sign. and this identifies walking speed as a key indicator for health as we age. So we've always been conscious about doing blood pressure, circulation quality, stability, bone density, all those sort of things, cardiovascular health. But now they're saying that as a sixth indicator, walking speed is a good indicator because it does give you a good indication of what's happening with everything else. Now, this is a test they recommend doing as you get older, and it's a 10-metre long test. So they get you walking and they work out where you are walking along in that 10-metre range to give you a good indication. So you're not trying to say you can walk 10 kilometres an hour. It's more about you can walk so many metres per second to give you a good indication. Now, this white paper says that it has the potential to predict future health status and functional decline, including the amount of time you'll likely be hospitalised, balance, and certainly one of the biggest impacts on your health as you age is falling. So ending up falling, breaking a hip, injuring yourself in any number of ways. So having that ability to balance and prevent falls is a huge indicator of length and quality of life as you age. So as I said, it's nothing to do with hiking itself, but it is something to consider as you get older because, you know, when you think about it, what were you like in your late teens and 20s and early 30s? And then as you get older into 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s, you will see the average person in their 70s and even 80s that aren't very steady on their feet and aren't very stable and will often have falls. So just some final thoughts. You should be able to tell from this podcast, if you haven't already known, that I'm a bit obsessive when it comes to collecting information. And I know most people won't go to the length that I do to work out walking speeds. Having said that, having a basic set of figures will not only help you to plan your hikes, but will also remove stress on trail because you'll have a good indication of how long you need to achieve your daily goals. I must admit, I've seen some memes on Instagram just recently was saying when your friend offers to take you on a 1-hour hike and you're still going 3 hours later and it's the best 5 hours you've ever done. That's often it's a bit of a jab at people who say, yeah, you haven't got far to go or you're almost there. But it's good to know roughly how long a walk is going to be. So if you're taking someone new hiking, you do want to say to them, it's going to be 5 hours for this walk, and don't try and make it say 5 hours when it's going to take 7 or 8. Or if anything, say it's 5 hours and you get it done in 4 and they feel really good about it. The thing with going through and also knowing your hikes is what time you'll get into camp and what time you need to leave camp the next morning to continue on. So as an example, if I'm going to be traveling at 2.75 kilometres per hour and I've got a 27.5 kilometre trip for the day, I know that's going to take me 10 hours. So if I start at 7 and finish at 5, because I include my breaks in there, I know that will get me there roughly between 7 and 5. If I don't start till 9 in the morning, it then becomes 9 till 7 at night. And if it's really dark and cold, you may not want to be doing that. So it helps to give you a good indication of when you need to leave camp and approximately when you need to arrive at camp. And I do say approximately here. I find that when I leave camp, I know that I will get to the end result or the camp for the next night by a certain time. So I might say 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock. But if I say 4 o'clock, I know I'll get there I tend to prefer to say somewhere between 3:30 and 4:30. It just gives me a little bit of leeway. Nothing worse than ending up still walking 2 hours later, unless you've actually planned for that. Now, when I do multi-week hikes, I do try and do some night hiking. I do love hiking at nighttime, and generally I will pick a full moon. And that's a full moon because I'm hiking in wintertime, roughly around about 5, 6, 6:30, or in the morning, probably around about 5:30, 6:30 in the morning as well. And, as the sun's coming up, but I've got the moon, because it means quite often, if it's a full moon that's above my head, I don't need to use a torch. And it's really an amazing sort of thing. Unless you've actually planned to do night hiking, you're better off knowing when you do need to leave and when you are going to arrive. And in my case, I like to arrive at camp while it's still light so I can set my tent up, cook my food, and by the time it's starting to get dark, I can get into my tent and I don't have to worry about finding bits of gear or shining torches around the place. One final comment I would make here is, as I mentioned when I did the Bibbulmun Track, I was walking at my fastest at 5.75 kilometres per hour. Even as fit as I was at that stage, it's not a pace I could maintain for the entire day. When I did my biggest day that I've done previously was 58.5 kilometres, and that took me roughly 15 hours. If I was doing 5.75 kilometres per hour, means I could potentially do it in 10.5 hours. That was just not a sustainable pace for that entire day. So you'll find that if you increase your speed, you might be able to push your speed to go faster, it means you should also look at reducing the number of hours that you hike. Increasing speed and increasing the duration of the hike, then you run a risk of potentially injuring yourself because you're pushing yourself to the limits both on speed and duration, and that's when it's potentially going to become an issue. So work out what your maximums are, work out what you need to cover for each day, and I use this case for the Hyson Trail, which I have been planning. I know what days I'm going through and doing and the distances I need to cover. Now, I'm not taking into account that I will build fitness on the duration of the hike. I'm purely planning it on what I'm physically capable of now, not what I'm capable 3 to 4 weeks into an 8-week hike. So I may find that by the time I get halfway into a hike, my speed has increased and my fitness has increased, covering bigger distances or taking less time to get there. So as I said, having at least a basic understanding of what your hiking speed is will help you plan your hike and help to take a lot of the angst out of getting in and out of camp on a daily basis. That's all for this podcast episode, brought to you by Australian Hiker. We hope it's helped in planning your upcoming longer hikes. That's all for me. Bye for now.